Blushing to their very toenails, a review from Thomas Cookson published on the 29th of the 3rd, 2014. It's taken time, but I feel I finally fully appreciate the tragedy of Colin Baker's Doctor and how this story marked a double whammy of the show losing two great white hopes at once. In License Denied, John Binns raised compelling questions of how Trial managed to impress a disillusioned BBC management enough to gain the show a renewal. I'd say Trial was, production-wise, a solid, impressively cast piece of light entertainment, but to us fans yearning for the kind of grit we'd gotten when Graham Harper was behind the camera, it was a sanitised, toothless abomination. I once bashed Trial for the same reasons. Now I feel differently. There's some strong, moody, existential undertones to the Trial season, moments where normality goes sour, which remind you what a unique show Doctor Who is. Yet it's inescapable that, for all its ambitions, the resolution is so limp and sloppy that ultimately the entire season feels like only half a story. A one-trick viewing at best, perhaps that's all the BBC wanted. It's also frustratingly clear that Robert Holmes is so close that a year or two ago he could have pulled it off, and back then the show would have dared let him take the Time Lord's corruption angle as far as he wanted. Ultimately, though, Eric is right. J&T, through Pip and Jane Baker, completely bastardised Holmes' vision. I think I knew that even when first watching this at age 11, when the story's tonal shifts and sense of temporal vertigo, and of course Perry's death, made it downright scary. But sometimes you unconsciously pick up on a change of authorial pen whilst watching, like how when Manhunter sticks to the page of the novel it's an intelligent thriller, but when dumb action cliches dominate the climax, you can tell it strayed from the source material and briefly become a dumber film, particularly in how the previously sharp-shrewd hero suddenly loses his wits and refuses to take a headshot on the killer in his sights because if he had, then there'd be no action sequence. The most telling differences between Holmes and the Baker's half of this story are that Holmes, not being too familiar with Mel, elects quite sensibly to make his own creation, Glitz, the story companion. Holmes' court scene is about the Ravelock's atrocity, and the Bakers practically jettison it in favour of the Vervoid's genocide business. This is a question of writers writing what they know, but it's also clear that the Baker's half is breathtakingly packed. It's as edgy, slick and witty as the Bakers ever get, but it's still packed, often in the wrong places. Hell, theirs comes off almost like a proto-Dimensions in Time. In Robert Holmes' vision, the Time Lords committed this atrocity for the sake of information control, which suggests Holmes hated the idea of higher elites withholding knowledge and information from those below the pecking order, and possibly believed that information should be free to all. You can tell Pip and Jane aren't so like-minded by how Glitz and the Master are presented as black hat thieves getting their comeuppance for their information theft. But what I found most morally troubling as a kid, and something I couldn't imagine Holmes writing, was the Doctor's alliance with the Master, knowing that the Master intends to kill his future self. Surely the Doctor would never agree to abet murder, particularly of someone who represents his future, and not when he has so many unanswered questions of why the Valiard's doing this. For one problem is it's never made lucid just how culpable the Valiard was in the Time Lord's atrocity, and ergo how evil he is. But Pip and Jane assume he's evil enough to let the story ignore and forget about the other corrupt Time Lords completely. Like I said, the things that made no sense didn't quite bother me on first viewing, because I somehow accepted the story's use of the Matrix setting as an escape route for logical questions, sidestepping into a realm without any logic. But nowadays it seems frustrating that such a potentially radical reimagining of the mythos ended up as ultimately so disposable. Doctor Who will play very safe from here on, to the point where even amidst mass Cybermen armies, vampires, fondant, surprise executions, special weapons, Daleks, and exploding planets, there isn't a single McCoy story where you could conceive or even fear for a moment that the Doctor might actually die or regenerate. Yes, I think the Doctor lost his dramatic edge when Colin was forced out. Certainly I can believe in Colin shouting down a whole decadent courtroom or intimidating Paul Darrow far more than I can believe the relentless artificiality of McCoy turning the tables on his interrogators in Paradise Towers. But we lost more than that. A new Doctor is a point of interest in himself. That's partly why the dwindling ratings of Logopolis dramatically shot up for Castrovalva, and likewise, even though the Davison era completely botched the show's prior cool, there was a great chance at a new lease of life and renewed popularity with Colin, not least from the burst of publicity of his casting, which J&T wisely milked. And even in spite of a terrible debut, poisonous inception, and a rocky first season, I feel Colin could have certainly overcome that and gone far, that he was so close to nailing the Doctor for a new decade as a self-assured shrewd hero with bite before great sabotage did its work, all combined to completely kill Colin's every chance on all sides. So why was J&T kept on by the BBC? There was a damning rumour that when J&T and his reportedly quite poisonous partner Gary Downey were meant to be doing location scouting in Singapore for a planned season 23 story, they spent the whole holiday getting trashed in the country's club scene, but on the last day they had to ferry a taxi around town and film locations from out the window. Apparently the BBC found out, and the story generated much notoriety above board. If true, it would illuminate how the separation of J&T's work and social life was non-existent by now, and now he had a drink problem was a rather chemically run producer, which would explain how the show had quickly fallen to a wino's vision under him, and how J&T played the part of a commanding, reigning authority figure, but was actually more recklessly obstinate than anything. But if so, then why was J&T kept on? He'd gotten the job on his budgeting skills, but such irresponsible indulgences probably would have made him seem more a liability than anything. But apparently, despite this, and despite the dramatic turn of sympathy away from the show in 1985, it didn't change how the BBC still saw J&T as one of their own, in spite of his failings. Apparently, the BBC even took J&T's side against Eric's published attack on him, even if they might have agreed with some of Eric's criticisms. So when it came to the question of what to do with J&T, maybe they decided they didn't feel right about just firing him, so maybe they just wanted to keep him where he was until they could find something for him. But perhaps simultaneously they felt he was still a liability and they didn't trust him with a new show, but they wanted to be a success. But since they didn't care about Doctor Who anymore, saw no hope in it, and since they felt the show had already had its success heyday, then it didn't matter if J&T further botched it. So they kept him on and figured capping the budget would curb his spending excesses and prevent any other holiday shoot fiascos. Maybe the BBC only kept the show alive to keep J&T's career alive, and I can't really begrudge them that. But alas, maddeningly, the BBC action against the show taught him nothing. He remained a liability. Even during the biggest crisis in the show's history, J&T was still making Eric Sayward's job of putting together scripts impossible. Eric had found writer PJ Hammond and negotiated a slot for his story Paradise 5, which would have been shown in Terror of the Vervoid's place. He was a contributing, willing writer, and J&T took one suspicious look at him and had Eric reject him out of sheer petty paranoia. There was no doubt why Eric finally jumped ship and why the trial season only got finished at all because of the intervention of the Bakers, twice. This does frustrate me, because it illuminates the way the show came close to discovering a few potential spiritual successors to Robert Holmes, only to squander or outright shun them, and PJ Hammond likely was one of them. And this is why J&T staying on was a problem. Yet we'd already had the spiritual successor to Holmes on the show under J&T's watch. If you look closely, you can see echoes of Enlightenment in The Ultimate Foe, just as there are echoes of Carnival of Monsters in Enlightenment. So really, there seemed no better candidate for Robert Holmes' successor than Barbara Clegg, but frustratingly, of her many story submissions, Enlightenment was the only one they ever accepted and made. If Big Finish's audio adaptations of The Elite and Point of Entry are anything to go by, we lost a goldmine. In fact, really, Barbara Clegg should have been the show's script editor, not Eric. But instead, when Robert Holmes died, we really did lose the great white hope, and regardless of how you feel about the McCoy era, it can't be denied that there was a hole and a void after this, but later had to be filled retroactively with the Dark Doctor, Secrets of Ancient Gallifrey business. Your mileage may vary over how well they succeeded. Sadly, while as much of the trial adventure was a clear mission statement of the show and its hero, with Colin Doctors outright defending the heart and purpose of the show on screen, and with no one understanding the Doctor's mission statement as an underdog snob better than Holmes, or at least no one was better suited to articulating it, the ending we get pretty much botches it. The Doctor is horrified by the atrocities of the Time Lords, but does nothing about it, forgets that it happened, and just leaves cheerfully. The Valiard is reduced to a lesser pantomime villain whose motivation for doing evil deeds is simply because the current good Doctor doesn't, making the Doctor's triumph over this Burke far less affirming than it should be. Which is typical, really, if Sayward is to be believed, that Holmes had created a villain that the Doctor wasn't supposed to be able to beat at all. So J&T's walk-down ending has to take the Valiard to the other extreme. It's also somewhat typical of J&T that when he calls the shots on the ending, all justification of the Doctor's moral purpose disappears under a producer who honestly can't see what was actually wrong with the show. I'm unsure how I feel about Perry's happy ending. I was always horrified by Mind Warp's ending, and there's still an inescapable overwhelming nastiness and misogyny about it, but I've wondered if it had been allowed to stand, whether it would have been as defining a moment of the Sixth Doctor as Genesis was for the Fourth, the moment where something happens that changes his whole outlook and view of himself and the dangerous universe he inhabits. Of course, since Colin was unknowingly on the way out, and such a character arc of guilt and redemption wasn't going to happen, maybe it's just as well it was undone. But John Binns is right. Changing Mind Warp's ending off-screen leads to the whole season feeling so vague and lacking in lucidity that it all might as well have not happened.